This is Black Views, bringing you the Black news, a commitment to informing the Black family. Please enjoy the presentation.
My name is John H. Crooker, and I am Criminal District Attorney, Harris County, Texas. I was informed of the mutiny and riots of the Negro soldiers of the 24th Infantry about 9 o'clock on the night of its occurrence.
About 3:30 p.m., we heard that Corporal Baltimore of our company had been shot by police officers. All the boys said, "Let's go get the man that shot Baltimore."
One grabbed me and pushed me out in front of him with his gun and started shooting at me. Earl seemed dazed and couldn't get out from under the wheel, and when this Negro shot me, they all seemed to go crazy, started shooting Earl. I fell flat in the ditch and lay there as if dead, and they let me alone.
Get out! This is my house! You ain't got no right to be here!
I think we're gonna have trouble tonight.
What kind of trouble, Sergeant?
Major trouble.
You all right?
And this was just the beginning of a night of terror, all but forgotten in the history of Houston. A night in which some 16 Houstonians, including 5 police officers, lost their lives. 5 soldiers were also killed. The riot resulted in martial law in Houston and ultimately led to the largest military trial in U.S. history.
The thing that always fascinates me is that nobody knows the story, or very few people do.
It's a fascinating and tragic story, born of a climate of racial tensions that were embedded in law. This is the story of what has come to be known as the Camp Logan riots, when toward the end of a long Houston summer, a group of African-American soldiers declared a mutiny on the bayou. Houston, Texas, 1917. Population 130,000, including 30,000 African Americans, the largest black population of any Texas city. Houston covered a total of 32 square miles on either side of Buffalo Bayou, and the town was on the threshold of a period of rapid growth. The citizens shared a sense of excitement about Houston's future. With 13 banks, 365 factories employing 10,000 workers, and annual exports of more than 3 million bales of cotton, Houston proudly claimed to be the largest inland port cotton market in the world. White and black citizens lived in 2 separate worlds. In fact, it was the law. Black Houstonians had their own saloons and restaurants, 4 movie houses, 3 weekly newspapers, and a separate professional baseball team called the Houston Black Buffaloes.
It was a very, very difficult time and place to live, never mind work and recreate and raise families. And this riot, this mutiny, is a manifestation of those social conditions.
After the Civil War, most southern states passed what were known as Jim Crow laws, creating separate arrangements for blacks and whites in schools, on public transportation, in restaurants, hotels, theaters, public parks, even doctor's offices. Some form of these laws remained in Houston and throughout the South until the early 1960s. It is difficult for most of us to imagine what things were like way back when, but Thelma Scott Bryant, Hazel Young, and Henrietta Wells lived through it.
The white man expected you to stay in your place, they say, and we knew how to stay in our place rather than, cause a lot of trouble. That was just the way it had to be at that time. You got out your place, well, then they put you back in it.
No matter how intelligent you were, if you were black, you didn't get any kind of recognition because white people resented smart niggas, as they say. Yeah. In fact, they went out of the way to show you didn't have any, they didn't respect you. I thought I was supposed to sit on the back of the bus. That was a part of growing up in the South. You knew your place, and your place was in the back of the bus.
I resented the segregation on the streetcars because when I came back from college, I resented it more. I had to get up and give the workers, the street workers and the construction workers, my seats. And they were dirty people. I thought they needed a bath. They didn't smell good. But I had to get up and give them my seat. And I didn't like the fact that I couldn't try on clothes. I couldn't try on shoes. I couldn't try on hats. I might buy something and take it home and it didn't look right, but I couldn't return it. I had to keep it. There were so many things like that that were demeaning.
I think most people today honestly have a lack of appreciation for how truly awful race relations were at this time period. You're talking about the very depths of white supremacy, which were in many ways worse than slavery. This was a volcano ready to erupt.
The police were pretty tough in that area. They loved to chase prostitutes, crap shooters, and they'd had a tendency to shoot at blacks to scare them and to show their virility.
The new reform-minded mayor had begun some major changes in the Houston Police Department. He appointed a new chief, Clarence Brock, who had been the park superintendent and had no law enforcement experience, a move that met with strong resentment and resistance on the force.
What Brock was trying to do was professionalize the police, trying to bring discipline, trying to make officers look like police in terms of their dress and demeanor. And I mean, they just laughed at him, and he didn't have the force of personality to do it.
On the surface, things seemed relatively peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of prejudice that could flare up in an instant, and sometimes with overwhelming force. And into this complex racial climate came the men of the 24th Regiment.
At the beginning of the war, the U.S. government established a number of National Guard training sites across the United States. There were 16 of them. And the cities bid for them because they realized that this would be a great deal of federal money, construction money, and all coming into the communities.
Houston leaders pursued their share of this business, and the Army agreed to build a training base for National Guard troops being recalled to active duty, a base to be known as Camp Logan, on the eastern edge of what is now Memorial Park. To guard the construction site, the Army decided to use members of the 24th Infantry, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a name given them in respect for their skill and bravery by the Native Americans whom they fought against in Texas and Indian territories. They had earned this respect again and again through over 4 decades of service, including the pursuit of Pancho Villa in Mexico under General Blackjack Pershing, and serving in Cuba with Teddy Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War.
The 4 Buffalo Soldier regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and the 24th and 25th Infantry, they served out west. You know, they built camps, forts, railroads, delivered the mail, strung telegraph wires, charting the land. They did all of these types of things. I mean, without the Buffalo Soldiers, you know, the westward movement would have been delayed 50 years.
Corporal Jesse Moore of Louisiana was among the black soldiers sent to Houston. Angela Holder is his great-niece.
And I was about 6 years old, and I saw this picture in my Aunt Lovey's house, and I said, well, who is that? She said, that's my brother Jesse. And I said, well, what happened to him? You know, I wanted to know all these whys and wins.
Later in junior high school, Angela Holder saw a picture in an American history book that prompted her to ask more questions about her great-uncle.
One thing I remember my mother was saying that he may have been in the service before, and that he was a bugler, and that he wanted to go back into the service, but his mother didn't want him to do it, that there might have been some type of premonition that something bad was going to happen to him.
24-year-old Private T.C. Hawkins was from a large family and grew up in North Carolina. He was one of 7 children, the grandson of a minister. He was raised in a close-knit religious family.
My aunt told me that my uncle was a great person, that he was a really super guy. And you had a group of colored soldiers, as they preferred to be called, that were proud to serve their country, that were proud to participate in the military.
And when the soldiers came, they came to Antioch. All the young ladies and the little ones too were admiring those soldiers from Chicago who came to our church. I was 12 years old looking up at soldiers who were looking better than anybody I had ever seen. I was trying to be seen too. Those are our heroes.
We did not know any soldiers personally, except the ladies were all trying to marry a soldier. I have a soldier boyfriend.
While the black community was excited, many white Houstonians were alarmed to hear black troops were stationed in Houston. Outside the black community, the soldiers quickly encountered a level of disrespect and discrimination they had seldom experienced before.
Well, to send soldiers from the north to a deeply southern ingrained town was just like waving a red flag. They resented those soldiers who looked better and had more evidently on the ball than the white people did. It was a situation that was tense.
So you have a town like Houston, it's more southern than western, although we consider it to be in the west. But the attitude at the time, the Jim Crow laws, the segregation, all of these things were going on, and you mix that with proud black men in blue uniforms, and you have a tragedy waiting to happen.
There were racial incidents from the very beginning, and that is to say that this came from various parts of the community. The white construction workers gave them a difficult time. The police of Houston particularly were felt to be vindictive against the soldiers. And might seem to be somewhat ironical, but the streetcar conductors were also considered to be very negative toward them.
The tension would continue to mount, and less than a month later, erupt in a night of violence.
Mutiny on the Bayou is brought to you in part by H-E-B, where we're proud to support Black History Month.
I've been working the line all along, from the time they arrived until they left. All them that rode the cars seem to have hard feelings towards riding behind the screens. A time or two, they throw the screens out the window.
The treatment of the soldiers on trolley cars and elsewhere paled in comparison to the violence the men of the 24th encountered with the police department. Houston Police Department historian Denny Hare.
The police officers at the time were not doing any way to welcome either. They were just as prejudiced as you might think they would have been, because it was a society thing. It was laws that were put into place and enforced that kept a group down.
Ira Rainey came to Houston in search of a better life for his family. He found it with the Houston Police Department. Sandra Heitman speaks of a great-grandfather she never knew.
There was always a sense of pride that he was a police officer. They used to have a lot of abandoned babies, black babies that would be abandoned, and because Grandma Rainey was always pregnant, and that Ira would bring these babies home to her to be nursed. So I can't, reconcile that with him being a racist.
It was a difficult time at best to be a police officer. We only had one black officer at the time.
One of the previous police chiefs said that they needed Houston needed to hire bloodhounds as a part of the police force, and particularly said to control the black people. So I think there was strong animosity against them. And this man, Lee Sparks, represented the worst of it.
Officer Sparks was the guy who, he had a reputation in Freedmanstown of being straight up, not just a racial bully, but an aggressive enforcer of white supremacy.
Dr. Robert Haynes wrote about Officer Sparks in his book, A Night of Violence, considered one of the most comprehensive accounts of the Houston riots.
Sparks was very proud of the fact that he could beat blacks over the head and get their, as he always put it, get their heart right. He always put a notch on his gun every time he shot one.
Sparks and his partner Rufus Daniels patrolled on horseback in the large black neighborhood in Houston's 4th Ward. Today's West Dallas was known as San Felipe, and the area was known as the San Felipe District. It was near here on the morning of August 23rd that Officers Sparks and Daniels spotted 2 black teenagers shooting dice in an alley. The dice shooters soon ran down the alley and right into the home of Mrs. Sarah Travers.
And she was ironing, and it was a hot day. She was dressed appropriately for the hot weather, but inappropriately for house guests. Then the cops came barging into her home and asked, had they seen these 2 crap shooters? And she resented the fact that they had invaded her private home.
Get out! This is my house! You ain't got no right to be here!
And obviously an altercation developed between Mrs. Travers and the 2 policemen, and they arrested her and carried her to a police box where they would call in and get the wagon to come and pick them up and take them to the jail. Now, it happened that a black soldier witnessed the screaming of Mrs. Travers, who resented being hauled into the jail, and he tried to come to her assistance.
An angry Officer Sparks pistol whipped the soldier, Private Alonzo Edwards, and took him to jail as well. When word reached camp, the provost guard on duty, Corporal Charles Baltimore, left for town to track down Officer Sparks.
And Baltimore was a model soldier, what even whites would call a good soldier, loyal, respected by both his officers, who were white, as well as the enlisted men themselves. And he came to inquire about the events that had taken place. And Sparks resented that. Again, tried to pistol whip Baltimore, who fled from the scene and hid under the bed of a local house, and police officers then finally tracked him down, beat him up, and took him to the police station.
And almost immediately, rumors began to spread through the camp that Corporal Baltimore had been killed. Back at police headquarters, Police Chief Clarence Brock confronted Officer Sparks about the 2 injured soldiers he had brought in that day. Sparks would be suspended overnight, pending a decision on further discipline.
And so they decided that they would allow Baltimore to go back to camp so that would prove that he had not been killed.
At camp, rumors persisted, even one that an angry white mob was on the way. Some soldiers became angrier, more agitated. Witnesses would later report that soldiers began stealing and hiding ammunition and circulating plans for retaliation against the white policemen that night. The men had a new commanding officer, Major Nealon Snow, with just 3 days on the job. Unlike his predecessor, Snow had very little contact with the black troops. Despite all the warning signs, he did very little to calm the building tensions. And shortly after nightfall, all the day's anger, injustice, and resentment would come to a boil. Houston, 1917. A military training base is being constructed for troops headed for World War I. Black soldiers were brought in to guard the construction site. Their presence here led to a different type of war on the streets of this segregated city. Even the weather was unsettled that August afternoon. It had been the driest year on record, with temperatures over 100 degrees that summer, and on this fateful day, at last, it finally began to rain. It was a release of pent-up energies that mirrored the situation in camp. A white officer brought Corporal Baltimore back to camp, hoping the news he was alive would calm the angry troops.
When those soldiers saw one of the most loyal black non-commissioned officers abused by a very racist white officer, it incensed them.
Believing things were calming down, Snow and the other white officers still planned to spend a relaxing evening in town.
Major.
Yes.
Sir, may I have a word with you?
In a moment.
But the troops were still upset. And around 8 p.m., Sergeant Vida Henry approached Snow to tell him.
What is it?
I think we're gonna have trouble tonight.
What kind of trouble, Sergeant?
Major trouble.
Soon after, Snow ordered all the men to assemble and turn in their rifles, but only a few did. With Sergeant Henry still at his side, Snow encountered a group of armed soldiers.
What's going on this evening? Advising a plan, sir. What kind of plan is that? Can't tell you, sir.
The mutiny had begun. Soldiers rushed the supply tents, overpowering the guards and taking guns and ammunition. They began to fire at random into the darkness. And Sergeant Vida Henry, who had warned Major Snow of trouble, emerged as the leader of the mutiny.
All right, guys, let's do this.
Born in Kentucky, the 35-year-old Henry was a career soldier. In 13 years of dedicated service, Henry had acquired the respect of his own men and white officers alike.
Vida Henry was I think, even more than Baltimore, was a black man who felt that he, as a soldier, deserved to be treated with respect. 30 minutes later, Henry led most of his company, our company, out of the bivouac at a little after 8.
Charles Wright encountered a handful of black soldiers when he ran to see what all the commotion was about. His brother explained what happened.
They phoned me and told me that my brother had been shot and that he was at St. Joseph's Infirmary. He told me that they had surrounded him. He said that they hollered, "Halt!" And when he raised both his arms, they shot him through both arms. And as he fell, they shot him again through his side. And when they were done shooting, they said, "We have got this white son of," and went marching on.
On the way toward Bruner Street, now Shepherd, Henry's column passed a house where 3 teenagers were on the porch. Spotting movement in the darkness, one of the boys told his sister to turn on the porch light, attracting the attention of the soldiers, who then shot out the light, killed one of the boys, and seriously injured another.
The minute things happened, word got out pretty quickly, and the town went berserk. People all over the city heard about it, raced downtown, robbed pawn shops and hardware shops, grabbed pistols. White people were scared to death.
Black Houstonians were frightened too. Henrietta Wells, who was 6 at the time, remembers white policemen entering her home to search for rioters.
And they banged on the door and said, "Open up," something like that. And my mother went to the door. We were there alone. And she opened the door and they said, "We're looking for soldiers." And they didn't even ask her if they could come in. They just pushed her aside and went in. And I was so frightened when those men came in the house, and I didn't know what they were going to do to my mother and me.
Hundreds of white citizens hurried into the downtown business district. They were armed with everything from rifles to slingshots. A second group of 1,000 whites gathered outside the police station, where the chief handed out firearms and sent them into the riot area.
And they poured into the area and ran smack dab into black soldiers as they were heading for the, in my opinion, the police department, but they never got there.
A third crowd of 400 or 500 gathered at the Bruner Fire Station on Washington, intent on lynching the soldiers still in camp. They were held back by members of the Illinois National Guard from Camp Logan, who by this time had been mobilized to control the riot. Sergeant Vida Henry's men crossed the bayou and marched east toward downtown. The violence continued. They fired on 2 policemen at the corner of San Felipe and Wilson, seriously injuring 1. A car pulled up containing a businessman and 4 police officers, including one of their biggest foes, policeman Rufus Daniels. Daniels charged, armed only with a pistol, and the soldiers shot him down. Remembering his role in the beating of Corporal Baltimore, the men battered Daniels' face with rifle butts and plunged bayonets into him. At Heiner Street, the soldiers encountered another car and killed 2 of its occupants, a civilian and Houston policeman, Ira Rainey.
Well, one of them comes up to the side of the car there and he says, "You get out of there, you damn son of a..." Well, I stepped out of the car then. It was about that time that Rainey, I think, made his run for the front of the car. And when he did, they shot him. They shot him right in front of the car.
Another vehicle containing white soldiers arrived and the men opened fire, killing Captain Joseph Matties. The soldiers had mistaken one of their own for a Houston police officer and gunned him down.
Now, the strange thing, of course, is that the Houston Mounted Police wore khaki uniforms. So it's very clear that the soldiers thought that Mattis was a police officer, not a United States Army officer of the Illinois National Guard. And when they discovered their mistake, I think this had a lot to do with changing the whole psychology of the march on Houston.
I can't go no longer, man.
Vida Henry and the men stopped to rest under a large tree near the railroad tracks, where they argued for almost 2 hours over what they would do next.
Is that all you're concerned about?
That's all I'm concerned about.
Around 2 a.m., the men split up. Corporal Baltimore led a large group that wanted to abandon the raid and headed toward camp. Sergeant Henry, who had been injured in the fighting, refused to join them and asked 3 or 4 of the men to shoot him. They refused.
And Henry was disappointed when even some of his strongest supporters joined those who wanted to go back to the camp. And he told them he was not going back. They, I think, suspected that he was going to kill himself, but they couldn't. They said goodbye to him in a kind of mournful way and left him.
A few minutes later, as they were marching north, they heard a single gunshot. Sergeant Vida Henry's body was found the next morning. His remains are in an unmarked grave here at the College Park Cemetery on West Dallas. In addition to Sergeant Henry, 3 other black soldiers were killed as a result of the riot. The entire riot was over in a matter of hours. 16 whites, including 5 police officers, were killed, among them Ira Rainey. His wife was left to raise 8 children alone.
All my mother has really, told me was the poverty, and just in our family, I guess generational poverty came from this, with the boys having to quit school, go to work early.
I think my grandfather carried a lot of that pain. And I knew him, he died when I was 6, about 6, but I think he had a lot of pain from that and a lot of anger. because he was a very young teenager at the time it happened, and I just don't think there's any way he could not have been affected by it. And I'm sure his being affected by it affected his children and us on down the line in some fashion.
It was a sad incident. It was an unfortunate incident, not only for my family, but it was an unfortunate incident in the city as well, because the more you read about the riot and how it all took place, it was a very sad set of circumstances, not only for the policemen who were killed, but also for those soldiers that were here at the time.
Several of Ira Rainey's descendants pursued careers in law enforcement. After the riot, demands for retribution were swift and loud. Rumors swept through both black and white communities in an atmosphere of fear and distrust. Police raided black neighborhoods, confiscating weapons and making arrests.
But all I know was the next night everybody was scared to get out, scared to move, because they thought the riot would come over that part of the country.
Well, you know, there was kind of a bad spirit between the blacks and the whites. Every time you went to the stores downtown, everybody just looked at you rather weirdly, you know, and you were afraid. You were really afraid because the tension was just high.
Fearing civilian retaliation, the military put all the black troops on a train less than 2 days after the riot, despite protests from city leaders.
City officials were absolutely chagrined, and I guess maybe even horrified by the military decision to pull the soldiers out immediately and to send them back to Columbus, New Mexico, because they wanted to try these soldiers. They were convinced that these crimes had taken place in their jurisdiction, and they wanted to see to it, quote unquote, that justice be done. And only in their hands could justice be done.
While the military began its own investigation, the Houston Citizens Review Committee began hearings less than a week after the riot. The committee heard testimony from 92 Houstonians on what happened that night. It didn't matter that many of them were not eyewitnesses. Everyone had an opinion on why the riot happened. Some witnesses put the blame on alcohol and immorality, or on the character of the soldiers and the many black citizens who came to visit the camp. Others criticized the white military officers for failing to keep the troops in line. In one of the few moves that pleased black citizens, the civil service rules were changed to make Officer Sparks' mistreatment of black citizens grounds for suspension. He was strongly criticized in the committee's final report, but they otherwise held the police blameless. But there were no speeches about the long history of friction between police and black Houstonians.
By the standards of 1917, they were enforcing the laws. The laws were wrong by those standards then and by standards now, but they were enforcing the law. Were they wrong? Were they brutal? Yes. Should they have done it the way they did even back then? No. But it happened. Should the soldiers have mutinied? No. Should there have been some system to stop this? Yes. Was there? No. Did they learn anything from it? No. Because they didn't talk about it.
Blacks were reluctant to express their true feelings, but many of them decided to leave Houston.
Within the black community itself, I think local blacks, Houston-based, Houston-born blacks, really saw that they could no longer be unquestioningly acquiescent, that they truly had to organize, that they really, and furthermore, the example of these soldiers to lay down their lives had to have had an effect.
While the citizens' hearings were underway, the Army was gathering evidence for the military trials to follow. Investigators were able to obtain a few confessions, but most of the accused maintained a vow of silence then and for the rest of their lives. The first court-martial began on Thursday, November 1st, here at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. During the trial, the 63 soldiers were held here. They were guarded by members of Company C of the 19th Infantry. Officially known as U.S. versus Nesbitt, the trial was held in the base's newly constructed Gift Memorial Chapel. A high-ranking court of brigadier generals, colonels, and lieutenant colonels sat in judgment on Sergeant William A. Nesbitt and 62 others for a long list of charges, ranging from disobeying orders to murder. It was the largest court-martial ever held in the continental United States. Colonel John Hull was assigned to prosecute, assisted by Major Dudley Sutphin, both experienced attorneys. Major Harry Greer was assigned to represent the defendants. A career soldier with almost no trial experience, he ended up working alone after his assistant was pulled to be a witness for the prosecution.
You don't have to be an attorney to defend under the Military Code of Justice. And Greer was not. Greer was just an officer who had at one time been associated with the 24th Infantry. And he understood, I think, the black soldier better maybe than some of the other officers would have. But he had no training.
In all, 194 individuals testified at the trial, many of them eyewitnesses to the events. 7 were soldiers who had admitted their participation in exchange for leniency.
We all rushed the supply tent and got our guns. Someone there was pitching ammunition right out the box. And Sergeant Henry asked, "Has everybody got their ammunition?"
In deciding which soldiers to charge, the prosecution relied mostly on roll call lists compiled in haste, in darkness, in the middle of the mutiny. It is likely that some of those charged had not participated in the riots, and that some who had were never charged.
Because the truth of the matter is, they couldn't identify any of these people. The whites who were wounded could not identify a single soldier. The only evidence they had was what these immunity witnesses told them.
The defense presented witnesses who contradicted the testimony of informants. T.C. Hawkins was one of the accused, yet one soldier swore he had remained in the camp.
"Yes, sir. Somebody touched me." He say, "Say, fella, can I sleep on your blanket?" I say, "Who was that?" He say, "Hawkins." He say, "I got tired of laying up under the trees. I thought I'd lay down." So I say, "Sure, help yourself."
In closing arguments, the prosecution held that all of the defendants were responsible for the killings, even if no one could prove they were directly involved. Summarizing the defense, Major Greer reminded the court of the soldiers' mistreatment by police, the lack of evidence of a conspiracy, the likelihood that many marched with Henry because they were afraid or were following orders, and he pointed out the many contradictions in eyewitness accounts. But his arguments did not move the court, which announced its decisions on the morning of Thursday, November 28th, less than a month after the trial began.
Brought to you in part by Academy Sports and Outdoors, in recognition of Black History Month. Academy Sports and Outdoors, the right stuff, the right price.
And little more than 3 months after the violent incidents of August 23rd, the military court in San Antonio announced the verdicts. 54 of the 63 soldiers were found guilty of all charges. 4 were declared guilty of willfully disobeying orders by leaving camp. 41 were sentenced to confinement at hard labor for the term of their natural lives. 5 were acquitted. 13 men were found responsible for masterminding the mutiny or leading the march. They were sentenced to be hanged. One of them was Charles Baltimore, whose arrest sparked the mutiny. Also sentenced to be executed, Jesse Moore and T.C. Hawkins.
You would think that somebody somewhere up the line would say, hey, you know, we need to stop. We need to take another look at this. We need to, you know, examine this again. But nobody did.
The mass execution took place in secret at dawn on December 11th by the banks of Salado Creek. The men had not been told of their impending execution until that very morning.
There was no press coverage. The Army thought it would be a spectacle if they had the news media there, so they circulated a rumor that the execution was going to be carried out at Leon Springs, which is about 20 miles away. And the reporters headed for Leon Springs, so none of them were present during the execution.
Despite great security from officers expecting the worst, the men surrendered to their fate peacefully and with dignity as they awaited their death. No one wept, and none of the men begged for mercy. Over 200 soldiers and law enforcement officers were assembled to prevent any trouble at the execution. After the men mounted the platform, a black minister and 2 white chaplains led a short prayer. The officer in charge said attention, and the men began singing a hymn. Their final words were a farewell to their guards, saying, "Goodbye, boys of Company C." As the men stood at attention looking straight ahead, the officer brought his raised arms down. The trap door swung open, and the men dropped 9 feet, meeting death, in the words of a witness, with neither bravado or fear. The men were buried in unmarked graves along Salado Creek, where they remained until 1937, when the Army needed the area for training purposes.
And one of the persons investigating the situation determined that the soldiers had not been dishonorably discharged before they were hanged, as would have been appropriate. So they were authorized burial in the National Cemetery.
Their fate was sealed in part because of their outrage over segregation in the city of Houston. Ironically, in death, these black soldiers became the first to integrate Fort Sam Houston Cemetery. For many, many years, the mothers and fathers of the soldiers had no idea exactly where their sons were buried. It was 17 years before Angela Holder's family got answers.
It made the family very sad. Like I said before, it was this big question mark. It was a big mystery. Where was Jesse? What really happened to him?
For others, the burden was almost too much to bear.
It tore my grandfather apart. He suffered greatly on that because he was very close to his sons. And according to my aunt, what she said was that my grandfather really never recovered from the tragedy.
Even in death, T.C. Hawkins declared his innocence. This letter arrived at his parents' home after he was hanged.
Dear Mother and Father, when this letter reaches you, I will be beyond the veil of sorrow. I will be in heaven with the angels. Mother, don't worry over your son, because
it is heaven's gain. Look not upon my body as one that must fill a watery grave, but one that is asleep in Jesus. I fear not death. I am sentenced to be hanged for the trouble that happened in Houston, Texas, although I am not guilty of the crime that I am accused of. But Mother, it is God's will that I go now, and in this way. And Mother, I'm gonna look for you and the family. If possible, I will meet you at the river. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. I will give thee rest. Bless his holy name.
The black soldiers were really in the vanguard of the civil rights movement. They were in a position to force the issue more than almost any of the other African Americans were able to do so.
I think that we should put this on the front burner. I mean, it's nothing to be ashamed of. You know, it's something that happened, but what do we learn from it? You know, how do we move forward? You know, how do we understand? How do we appreciate, you know, that terrible night, you know, August the 23rd, 1917?
We've seen big changes in the police department, and they make sure everybody's going through the cultural diversity classes so that we understand everybody, and what, you know, might not insult me would sure insult someone else, and so we're all sensitive to each other's feelings, or we should be.
I think when you read about the actual stories of each individual victim, it's very sad because most of the victims were not involved in what was going on within the city, within the police department, or within the military. They were just innocent victims. They got in the way.
About tolerance, acceptance, treating people as you would like to be treated, that no one is better than anyone else, and we're all in this scheme of life. We all need each other.
For more information on this program and the Camp Logan riots, go to khou.com.